Hey guys, tonight we are diving into the messy, awkward and sometimes hilarious world of dating in medieval times, where romance came with mud on your boots, gossip at the market, and parents lurking in every corner. And let me warn you that you probably would not survive this place for even a single evening, because there are no antibiotics, no deodorant, and everyone has an alarming enthusiasm for carrying knives. But that is all part of the charm of our little journey. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And since I am curious about the small universes you are all tuning in from, leave a comment with your location and the local time, so I can imagine this sleepy story unfolding in many different corners of the world. And now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Beginning in the fading glow of the setting sun, where shadows stretch long across crooked rooftops, and the ringing of church bells echoes against walls built centuries before you were even a thought. Because here in the twilight of this town, love does not begin with swipes or emojis, but with lingering stares across markets where pigs squeal at inconvenient moments and someone inevitably drops a basket of onions at the worst possible time, so you step carefully over the uneven stones and notice the town slowly shifting from the chaos of daytime trade into the whispering calm of evening, when families huddle around hearths, merchants shutter their stalls, and only the taverns and the occasional reckless minstrel keep the air alive with sound. And it is in this drowsy transition where the story of medieval dating really begins. Not with the fiery passion that Hollywood adores, but with something softer, slower, and occasionally awkward enough to make you want to bury your head in your wool cloak. Because imagine trying to flirt while your breath smells faintly of salted fish, and there is always at least one goose attempting to bite your leg. Yet people here somehow managed, driven by the same longing for connection that hums through human history, though the methods they used might strike you as charmingly absurd, like reciting poems so long that both speaker and listener probably forgot the point halfway through, or sending a lock of hair as a token of affection, while silently praying that lice were not included in the gift. And you walk deeper into the town, past narrow doorways where mothers scold children for muddying their tunics, past the blacksmith who hammers late because someone ass-horse threw a shoe on the road to the next village, and past the flickering lanterns that glow like little pockets of warmth against the cool dark. And as you wander, you notice that the atmosphere itself feels expectant, like the town is holding its breath. Because tonight, there will be chances, fleeting ones, for glances, whispers, and gestures that may bloom into something larger, or may simply become another thread of gossip, traded at the well tomorrow morning. And while historians are fairly confident about certain customs, like the elaborate rituals of courtly love promoted in the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine, there are still debates about how deeply these ideals filtered down to the common people, because it is one thing for a noble knight to kneel dramatically in front of a lady whose gown costs more than your yearly wage, and quite another for a tired miller's son to awkwardly hand over a piece of bread as a makeshift proposal. And so as you walk, you begin to sense that medieval romance existed on a spectrum, with glittering castles and love songs on one side, and mud-spattered boots and practical marriages on the other. And in between there was a messy human space where real attraction simmered, sometimes secretly, sometimes openly, but always tangled up with rules, expectations, and the silent understanding that life here was short and uncertain, which perhaps made the need for connection all the stronger. And as you pause by a fountain in the center of town, where a carved stone lion spits water into a basin green with moss, you feel a tug of curiosity about how someone in this time would have looked at you, whether they would have seen mystery danger, or perhaps simply another potential spouse, whose family might bring a modest but useful dowry, and you wonder, not without a hint of humor, whether anyone here ever thought of love as something purely for pleasure, or whether it was always a careful blend of strategy, survival, and just enough sweetness to make the arrangement bearable. And the truth is probably somewhere in between, as it often is, though historians still argue whether ordinary people in medieval towns experienced romantic love the way troubadours described it, or whether those flowery poems were nothing more than fancy PR for the nobility. And while you lean on the cool stone of the fountain, the night deepens around you. Torches flare against the encroaching dark, And in the distance you hear laughter spill from a tavern door, mingled with the strum of a lute and the slosh of ale. And you realize that even though this world feels alien, it thrums with the same heartbeat as yours, restless and searching in the quiet hours, and this recognition, soft as candlelight, guides you deeper into the story we are about to explore together, into the heart of the town, where the market stalls cling stubbornly to life, even as the light fades. And this is where medieval dating often began, not with declarations of eternal love or sweeping gestures, but with the simplest act of two people seeing one another across a crowd of turnips and salted fish. Because first glimpses mattered here more than you might expect, though. Unlike the movies, nobody is standing around in spotless velvet waiting to fall head over heels. Instead, you see wool tunics patched 3 times hair, tangled from the day's work, and cheeks flushed not with desire, but with the effort of carrying water uphill. And yet those first silent stares could still spark entire stories. Because for many people in medieval towns, marriage was the end goal, and any potential spouse was worth at least a few lingering glances. And you notice how men hover awkwardly near fountains or wells, pretending to wait their turn, but really hoping to cross paths with a particular girl who just happens to fetch water at the same time. And the girl might pretend not to see him, but will very carefully not leave too quickly. Because even subtle hesitation is enough to speak volumes in a world where words themselves could carry dangerous consequences. And as you linger, you realize that the silence itself becomes a language, filled with nervous smiles, eyes darting away, and the kind of awkward shifting on one's feet that is apparently universal to the human condition. Though here it comes with the added challenge of trying not to step into horse droppings while making eye contact, which is perhaps the least romantic but most historically accurate version of flirting you will ever imagine. And in this space of glances and silences, you sense that dating was both simple and impossibly complex. Because unlike today, where you might strike up a conversation in minutes here, those early moments could stretch out over weeks, with each encounter built on layers of ritual gossip and the unspoken question of whether the family standing behind you would approve. Since in most cases, your choice of partner was never entirely your own, and yet people still found ways to play this strange game of attraction, weaving desire into the fabric of daily chores, until even fetching onions could feel like a flirtation. And historians often point out that courtly love literature, the stuff written by troubadours and minstrels, painted these first encounters as charged with cosmic significance, like the lady's glance was meant to pierce the knight's soul. But historians still wonder how far that ideal really filtered down into the lives of common townsfolk, because it is hard to imagine a baker's apprentice swooning at a glance when he was more likely to swoon from the heat of the oven. And yet the cultural pressure to see romance as grand and transformative must have touched even the simplest households, shaping how people thought about the meaning of that first look. And then there is the curious detail found in some accounts that young women would deliberately make eye contact during church services, because apparently, even while everyone was supposed to be listening to sermons about sin and eternal damnation, the human brain found time to wonder if the boy across the aisle might be worth marrying, which proves that no matter the century, attention spans have always wandered, and you pass by the wooden doors of the church, now hearing the low hum of evening prayers and picturing the silent games of eye contact being played under the suspicious gaze of clergy, who probably suspected more than they ever admitted. And while all this might sound innocent, those first exchanges could carry immense weight, because in a world where reputations spread faster than disease, one glance too many might set tongues wagging. And if you think gossip today travels quickly, imagine a small town where everyone shares the same single well and spends hours every day waiting in line. And now picture how efficiently news of who looked at whom would spread, until by the end of the week, everyone had an opinion on whether the cobbler's daughter was dangerously flirtatious or merely polite. And this fragile web of perception made every first look both thrilling and risky. And yet without those looks, nothing could begin, which perhaps explains why so many stories of medieval love begin with something as small as a glance across a courtyard, a detail so delicate you might miss it if you did not know to pay attention. And as you continue through the marketplace, you hear the echo of these moments, the quiet heartbeat of a society where even the smallest gestures might become the foundation for entire lifetimes. And you cannot help but wonder whether people actually felt the same butterflies of attraction that you might today. or whether they framed it differently as a kind of divine sign or practical convenience. And that is the open question that historians still wrestle with, because while literature insists on passion and destiny, economic records remind us that dowries and inheritances often mattered more than feelings, leaving us to ask whether a medieval glance across the market was more about romance or property rights. But as you watch the lanterns flicker across uneven stones and hear a girl laugh a little too loudly near a boy who just happened to appear at the same, well, you realize that even if the economics ruled on paper, the heartbeat of something softer and less practical still pulsed beneath the surface. And that heartbeat, fragile and persistent, is what keeps you walking deeper into the night, ready to see how these glances evolve into something stranger, riskier, and perhaps even more ridiculous as the story unfolds. You leave the hum of the market behind and drift toward the quieter lanes where stone houses press close together and wooden shutters squeak in the evening air. And here you begin to notice something both theatrical and absurd about medieval dating. The ritual of chivalry that seemed to place knights and ladies on a stage, built from exaggerated politeness and awkward devotion. Because while you might imagine some gallant knight knocking politely at a doorway with flowers in hand, the reality was usually more like a nervous young man trying to balance on uneven boots while reciting lines of poetry he barely remembered. And yet this theatre mattered deeply, because gestures were everything, and chivalry was less about actual affection and more about performance. A performance that everyone knew was slightly ridiculous but continued anyway, because without it, the entire social script would crumble. And as you linger by a doorway, you watch a man bow so low that he nearly collides with a passing dog, which is about as historically accurate as it gets, since medieval manuals on courtesy did indeed encourage elaborate bows, though they never mentioned what to do when your gesture of respect results in a headbutt with livestock, and you find yourself both amused and fascinated by the gap between the ideals and the messy reality. Because the well-known fact is that the concept of courtly love shaped much of the language and rituals of medieval romance, with troubadours singing endless verses about noble knights suffering in devotion to unattainable ladies. But the quirky truth, hidden in letters and diaries, is that many of these knights were far less noble than the poem suggested, often juggling multiple ladies, sometimes forgetting their carefully written lines, and occasionally bribing scribes to draft their poetry for them. Which makes you wonder how much of this chivalry was sincere, and how much was just medieval outsourcing of emotional labor. And historians still debate whether courtly love was ever truly practiced as it was written, or whether it functioned more as an intellectual game for the nobility, a way to show off cultural sophistication rather than genuine desire. Because it is one thing to write that you will die without a lady's glance, and another thing entirely when you are really more concerned about whether the bread at supper will be moldy again. And as you follow the soft glow of torches along this narrow lane, you imagine how much pressure these rituals created, with men expected to appear endlessly patient and women expected to appear endlessly unattainable, a kind of social theatre where everyone knew their roles, but few people truly enjoyed the script. And yet, despite its artificiality, there is a strange sweetness in the thought of someone memorizing verses for you, even if their voice cracks or they mispronounce half the Latin, because in that moment the performance, however clumsy, still communicates the universal truth of someone trying. And perhaps that was all that really mattered, because effort itself was a form of love. Though of course the neighbors probably had their own running commentary about how embarrassing it looked, since gossip has always been the silent audience at every performance. And as you walk past another doorway where a girl pretends to scold her suitor for his persistence, you catch the sparkle in her eye that betrays her amusement, and you realize that even in a world obsessed with rules, people found ways to turn the rigid script into something playful, bending it just enough to feel human. And maybe that is why these stories still resonate centuries later, not because the gestures were flawless, but because they were flawed, and yet still attempted a reminder that love, no matter how formalized, has always been a little silly, a little brave, and more than a little exhausting. And you keep walking, carrying that thought with you, as the street curves toward the square where families hover like shadows at the edges, waiting to approve or disapprove of this carefully choreographed show at the doorstep. A reminder that even the most romantic gesture never truly belonged to just two people. but always to the entire watchful world around them. You step away from the clumsy bowing and theatrical devotion at the doorway, and soon you begin to feel the heavier, quieter presence that always lingered behind every medieval flirtation. The family, because no matter how passionately someone sighed in the moonlight or how sincerely they recited their borrowed verses, it was often the mother, father, uncles, cousins, and occasionally even distant godparents who decided whether this little drama would ever move forward. And you sense that in this world, family approval is not just background noise, but the main act shaping every possibility before it can bloom. Because unlike today's casual dating, where you might nervously introduce someone to your parents after months, in medieval times, the family was already there in spirit, weighing your choices, tallying your worth, and whispering their opinions like ghosts over your shoulder. And as you walk past a wooden house with smoke curling lazily from its chimney, you hear the muffled sound of a family arguing inside, perhaps about the value of a dowry or whether the neighbor's son really counts as respectable when he still owes 3 chickens in rent. And you realize that dating here was not just about 2 people locking eyes across a market, but about 2 entire households calculating whether this union would bring more bread to the table, or at the very least fewer enemies to fight. And the well-known fact is that marriage in the Middle Ages was largely a business arrangement, a transaction of property alliances and social standing, sometimes formalized in contracts so detailed they could rival modern legal documents. But the quirkier truth, tucked into village records and scattered anecdotes, is that families sometimes arranged betrothals when the children were still toddlers, meaning that little Hans could be promised to little Greta before either of them could even walk properly. And while everyone claimed this was practical, it does make you wonder about the first meeting years later, when both parties realized they had been committed to someone whose only known quality was that their parents once agreed over a barrel of ale, and historians still debate just how much freedom ordinary people had in these choices. Because while the nobility certainly treated marriage as politics, it remains uncertain whether commoners always had to obey parental approval or whether they sometimes managed to choose for themselves, with parish records hinting at both possibilities. And as you wander further into the lane, you feel the weight of these expectations pressing down like an invisible yoke. Because even if you were deeply in love, you might find your father reminding you that affection does not plough fields or mend roofs, while your mother might note that marrying someone with 2 good cows is far more reliable than marrying someone with a charming smile. And yet, despite the practicality of it all, people still rebelled, whispering behind doors, meeting in secret, and occasionally risking everything for affection, which makes you think that perhaps the family's power was never absolute, even if it was intimidating. And you notice a boy lingering outside a house, nervously holding a ribbon he hopes to offer. But before he can knock, the door opens and a stern-looking aunt eyes him like a hawk sizing up a mouse. And you cannot help but laugh softly at the absurdity, because even in matters of love, medieval people apparently had to survive a gauntlet of relatives, each one armed with unsolicited opinions. And perhaps that part has not changed much through the centuries, though at least now you are less likely to have your marriage prospects weighed against the family's grain storage. And the deeper you walk into this world, the more you recognize that love here was never truly private. It was communal, woven into the fortunes and failures of everyone who shared your blood, which makes you wonder whether people still manage to carve out small spaces of intimacy amid the noise. And perhaps they did, in stolen glances, whispered words, or the careful exchange of gifts too small to be noticed. Because even under the stern gaze of parents and the practical calculations of uncles, human hearts still found ways to sneak past the ledgers. And so you continue on, the sound of bickering families fading behind you as the path turns toward another layer of medieval romance, one that involves tokens, trinkets, and offerings, both sweet and slightly bizarre. You step further down the crooked street and notice how affection, once filtered through the layers of family approval, had to squeeze itself into the oddest little rituals, because here in the medieval town, courtship was not a grand sweep of flowers or moonlit carriage rides, but rather a patchwork of tokens, gestures and gifts that ranged from genuinely sweet to thoroughly questionable. And as you stand near the corner of a tavern, you watch a boy nervously hand a girl a ribbon. He has spent hours braiding, a gesture that feels simple but carried enormous symbolic weight, because to give someone a token was to stake a claim, to whisper without words that they held your heart. Though of course ribbons and rings were not the only gifts exchanged, for sometimes affection came in the form of a carved wooden spoon, a pair of gloves, or, in one especially charming but strange custom, an apple split in half so each person could eat a piece, which sounds romantic until you remember that medieval teeth were not exactly in their prime, so the exchange might have involved more awkward chewing than poetic symbolism. And the well-known fact is that knights and noblemen often sent tokens to ladies as signs of their devotion, sometimes even embroidering favors into handkerchiefs that could be worn during tournaments, making courtship into a public spectacle of loyalty. But the quirkier truth from village folklore is that among common folk, a suitor might sometimes offer his beloved not jewelry, but a live animal, perhaps a chicken or even a goose, which certainly speaks volumes about his priorities. Nothing says eternal love, quite like a bird that will squawk loudly enough to wake the whole household at dawn, and you cannot help but smile at the image of a young woman trying to feign gratitude while wrestling a flapping goose into her apron. And while these gestures might sound ridiculous to you, they were often remembered for years, carried like relics of affection, tucked away in memory long after the ribbon had frayed or the chicken had met its culinary fate. And historians still wonder whether these rituals were more about practical utility or genuine romance. Because while noble traditions painted love as transcendent, village gifts suggest that practicality, like offering an animal that could lay eggs, was often entangled with affection, and perhaps both truths coexisted, with the noble poems existing in castles and the practical chickens squawking in the mud of villages. And you lean against a wooden post and watch another exchange unfold, this time with a young man presenting a belt buckle he has hammered out himself. And the pride on his face suggests he has poured more feeling into the metal than he could ever put into words, because in a society where literacy was rare, gifts often spoke louder than poems, carrying messages of commitment in forms that could be worn, held, or eaten. And though these rituals may seem clumsy, they carried a power you cannot dismiss, because in a world with few private spaces, a gift was a tangible promise, something that outlasted fleeting words and proved intention, even if the intention came wrapped in feathers. And as you turn a corner, you notice the tavern door swinging open, spilling laughter into the night. And inside, a man is strumming a lute while a girl shyly fingers a sprig of rosemary. Someone slipped into her hand. And you recall that herbs too were part of this strange language of love, with rosemary symbolizing remembrance and parsley sometimes carrying meanings that were far less romantic, though the symbolism often shifted from town to town, making it a minefield of interpretation. Give someone the wrong plant, and you might accidentally propose marriage or insult their cooking, which, given medieval cuisine, might not be easily forgiven. And while all these tokens feel tender, you also sense the undercurrent of risk, because gifts could tie you to a person in ways you might regret. And a ribbon exchanged in private might later be used as proof of a promise, binding you into obligations you never intended, which makes you wonder how many young lovers hesitated before passing over that carved spoon, fearing that their affection would be turned into a contract. And perhaps this explains why some people chose subtler gestures, brushing hands at wells or sharing drinks from the same cup, finding romance in fleeting acts that could not be held up as evidence later. And you imagine the thrill of such small moments, how they must have burned brighter because of their very fragility. And you cannot help but ask yourself whether in a world so crowded with rules, the smallest gestures were in fact the most powerful, carrying more weight than all the grand tokens combined. And as the laughter from the tavern fades into the quiet of the night, you carry these thoughts with you, stepping deeper into the alleyways where whispers and shadows promise even stranger rituals waiting to unfold. You leave behind the tavern and drift deeper into the maze of crooked lanes, where the torches sputter out and the moonlight has to work harder to guide you. And here in the shadows you discover that love, or at least the hope for it, is not confined to daylight rituals and noisy markets, but instead spills quietly into the night. Because medieval lovers often met in secret, when the eyes of family, neighbors, and gossips were finally too weary to watch. And as you move silently through the narrow space between two timbered houses, you notice a pair of figures standing far too close, their voices lowered to the kind of conspiratorial murmur that tells you this is not a conversation about weather or harvest yields, but something charged with more risk. For in a world where chastity was preached from pulpits and suspicion spread as fast as candle flames, a secret meeting could mean the difference between a sweet memory and social ruin. And it was well known that the ladder at the window, trope you might think of as purely Shakespearean, actually had roots in real practices, with young men sneaking up to the chambers of maidens, or at least to the ground floor shutters, in order to whisper through the slats. Though the less glamorous truth is that more often these meetings took place not in picturesque balconies, but in the smelly alleys behind kitchens or near pigsties. Because anywhere that offered cover was better than being caught in the open, and one quirky detail that might surprise you is that lovers sometimes arranged to meet not at night, but in the grey dawn, slipping out under the excuse of fetching water from the well, which had the added benefit of plausible deniability if someone noticed, though it must have made for very awkward mornings if both families used the same well and happened to meet there. And as you creep past the shadows of a barn, you hear the soft squeak of a door hinge, a reminder that secrecy was often betrayed, not by loose tongues, but by creaking wood and barking dogs, both of which historians suspect were more effective chaperones than any stern parent. And you wonder what it must have felt like to risk so much for a few whispered words, or a quick brush of hands, because for every sweet tale of midnight romance, there must have been dozens of stories ending in angry confrontations, punishment, or worse. And historians still debate just how much of medieval romance was tolerated under the surface. For while official doctrine condemned unsanctioned liaisons, the sheer number of laws and sermons railing against them suggests that people were ignoring those rules quite frequently. And you might smirk at the thought that if preachers had to keep warning against midnight meetings, it meant that half the town was sneaking out anyway, proving once again that human nature has never been particularly obedient. And perhaps you would laugh softly at how little has changed, though you also feel the tension of their risk, because for a young woman especially, being caught in the wrong place at the wrong hour could mean gossip, spreading faster than a spilled barrel of ale, and reputations once stained were almost impossible to wash clean. And yet here you are, wandering among the hushed corners where two silhouettes lean against each other, speaking so softly you cannot quite hear. And maybe that is the point. Because secrecy was not only a necessity, but part of the thrill, the beating heart of forbidden love that pulsed louder in the dark. And you can almost sense how each meeting was a gamble, each whisper a dice roll against discovery. And though you might laugh about the romance of standing in the mud while pigs shuffle nearby, you cannot deny the electricity of those moments, nor the resilience of people who found ways to connect even in a world stacked against them. And as you move past a shutter, and hear the muffled giggle of a girl, followed by the sharp hush of a boy, worried about being overheard, you are reminded that not all these encounters were solemn or tragic. Some were just playful, silly moments of stolen joy like teenagers of any era trying to push against boundaries. And you cannot help but imagine how many loves began in these shadowy alleys, and how many stories ended before they even began, leaving only rumors and unanswered questions drifting like smoke into the night. You step out from the alley's shadow and into the faint glow of a torch. And as your eyes adjust, you realize that if secret meetings thrived in darkness, then the opposite force of medieval romance was daylight supervision, because nearly every glance, word, or even accidental brush of hands could be monitored by the eternal presence of chaperones. Those human watchdogs whose job was less about guarding safety and more about strangling spontaneity. And you see them everywhere, in the form of stern mothers perched on benches with their sewing. Fathers leaning against walls pretending to check cartwheels, but clearly watching every movement, or nosy neighbors who had long ago decided their true calling in life was to be unpaid informants. And the well-known fact here is that noble families insisted on strict supervision of their daughters with courtly encounters, often staged in public halls or gardens, where witnesses were abundant, because reputations were currency, and one whispered scandal could devalue a girl faster than rotten grain in the marketplace. But among commoners, the rules were just as rigid in their own way, with gatherings at church, markets, or festivals, often supervised by relatives who had an almost supernatural ability to appear just when things became interesting. And one quirky detail you overhear in the gossip is that some households went so far as to assign younger siblings as shadow chaperones, turning mischievous little brothers or sisters into reluctant spies, though of course they could be bribed with pastries to conveniently not see anything, which must have made for an odd economy of treats in exchange for silence. And as you picture a 12-year-old boy gleefully pocketing honey cakes while his sister pretends she was never speaking to that boy by the well, you cannot help but laugh quietly at how universal sibling bargaining has always been. Yet for all the watchfulness, you sense that chaperones were not foolproof, and indeed historians still debate whether their presence genuinely prevented impropriety, or merely forced young lovers to become more creative, because the constant records of secret meetings, scandals, and church fines suggest that either medieval chaperones were astonishingly bad at their jobs, or the young people were astonishingly determined, and you suspect both are true, because as you watch the scene of a girl spinning wool while her aunt stares unblinkingly at the boy across the courtyard, you notice the girl subtly drop her spindle, creating just enough distraction to share a fleeting smile, proving that ingenuity will always slip through the cracks of authority. And perhaps the strangest part of all is how normalized this supervision was. For no one thought it odd that a pair of lovers could never be alone, that every gesture was observed, dissected, and often reported by neighbors who enjoyed the drama as much as any bard's tale. And you pause to consider how exhausting it must have been to fall in love under constant surveillance, like living in a reality show without cameras, but with just as much gossip. And yet there is also a peculiar comfort to it, for while stifling the presence of chaperones could provide a safety net, ensuring that expectations remained clear, that promises had witnesses, and that accusations could be defended. Though whether that was protection or control depends on how you look at it. And as you stroll past a wooden bench where an elderly grandmother dozes while supposedly guarding her granddaughter, you cannot help but wonder how many romances bloomed not despite supervision, but because it created the illusion of safety, a paradox historians still puzzle over, since chaperones seemed both guardians and facilitators, simultaneously enforcing morality and providing the backdrop for rebellion. And as the torch sputters overhead and a church bell tolls in the distance, you realize that the medieval world was a stage where everyone watched, everyone whispered, and every love story unfolded under the unblinking eyes of family and strangers alike, making each smile, each stolen glance, and each subtle rebellion all the more daring. You slip away from the stern gazes of the chaperones and follow the faint rhythm of drums and pipes until you find yourself in the heart of a village square, suddenly flooded with color and noise, because if ever there was a loophole in the medieval rules of romance, it was festivals, those chaotic explosions of song, drink, and spectacle that gave everyone the chance to pretend they were not being watched, even though in truth they probably still were. But the crowd made it easier to blend in, and as you weave through dancers stomping in circles on the packed earth, you realize that festivals were perhaps the only socially acceptable spaces for flirting, where a laugh at the wrong joke or a hand lingering during a dance could be brushed off as innocent festivity, with parents watching carefully for which pairs gravitated toward each other during the games and dances, while priests grumbled about the sinful temptations of music, but rarely managed to dampen the merriment. And one quirky detail you notice among the stalls is a game where boys try to balance mugs of ale on their heads, while girls throw flower petals at them, which serves no purpose other than laughter, but conveniently gives both sides an excuse to look each other in the eye without drawing suspicion. And you imagine the nervous energy of those stares, the way a petal might stick in someone's hair and linger as an unspoken token of affection, and you chuckle at the thought of future generations explaining that their grandparents' love story began with a mug, a wobble, and a flower petal to the face. And though all this might seem charming, you remember that historians still argue about how much of this festival freedom was genuine release and how much was carefully managed spectacle. Because while some records suggest village youths had free rein to mingle, others imply that elders hovered even here, using the noise of the music as cover for their continued supervision. Though perhaps the truth is somewhere in between, where love blossomed in the cracks of festivity, slipping between moments of watchfulness like dancers stepping off beat, and as you move deeper into the square, you notice the masks, painted and feathered, worn during certain feast days to blur identity, and allow a kind of playful anonymity. And you cannot help but smile at the idea of a medieval masquerade, where a girl might flirt with a boy behind a wooden mask shaped like a bird, only to discover later she had been whispering sweet nothings to her cousin, a mistake that surely must have happened at least once, though no chronicler had the courage to record it. And you hear laughter ring out as a group of jugglers toss apples into the air, while a group of girls cheer for one performer more loudly than the rest, proving that even in an age of rigid courtship rules, showmanship went a long way toward winning admiration. And perhaps you raise an eyebrow at how little has changed in human history, since people still seem to equate juggling skills, whether of apples, words, or wealth, with attractiveness, though you admit there is something timelessly magnetic about confidence under fire, even if that fire is only a torch balanced precariously on someone's nose. And you watch as the dancing grows wilder, young men linking arms with young women in circles that spin until the torches blur into streaks. And in this frenzy, the boundaries between propriety and flirtation melt. And you wonder how many of these meetings, these laughs and dances, became the seeds of marriages or scandals whispered about for years. And the music swells, the crowd roars, and for a moment the weight of watchful eyes seems to vanish, leaving behind only the possibility of connection, fleeting but unforgettable, and you drift slowly through the square following the last notes of a fiddle, as the night deepens and the flirtations scatter into the shadows, leaving behind garlands of flowers, spilled ale, and the faint aftertaste of promises made beneath the roar of festival firelight. As the last echoes of festival music fade into the night, you drift toward the edge of the square, where a lone minstrel strums a lute, and in his trembling voice you begin to feel the weight of how love in the medieval world was not only acted out in dances or whispered in alleys, but also written, sung, and embroidered into the fabric of daily life. Because words themselves became gifts, though far more dangerous than ribbons or chickens. For once set to rhyme, a lover's feeling could travel farther than intended, sung at a feast or whispered by a troubadour in some distant town. And the well-known fact here is that the entire concept of courtly love emerged in the courts of southern France, turning romance into an elaborate game where knights pledged themselves to ladies, often married ones, in acts of loyalty that were more symbolic than practical. Though anyone watching a knight pine away for a woman he could never touch might have wondered if symbolism really made the ache any easier. And yet this idea spread like wildfire, shaping how Europe thought about desire for centuries, with poems describing lovesick knights growing pale and thin, swooning over glances like they had caught some contagious disease, which, to be fair, was not too far from how people still talk about heartbreak today. Though the less glamorous truth is that much of this ideal love was written by men with ink-stained fingers who probably had more calluses on their quills than on their swords. And one quirky detail you cannot ignore is that some poets went so far as to claim fainting in the presence of their beloved, as if swooning dramatically on the cold floorboards was the height of passion, which makes you wonder how many poor servants had to drag lovesick men out of doorways while trying not to roll their eyes. And historians still debate whether these poems reflected real emotions or whether they were largely performative, a literary fashion meant to flatter nobles and entertain courts, because while some lines drip with genuine longing, others feel suspiciously like they were composed to secure a free meal from a patron who enjoyed being compared to the moon or a saint. And as you walk beneath a balcony, you hear the soft recitation of verses a boy muttering awkwardly as he tries to memorize lines stolen from a popular troubadour, proof that poetry was not limited to nobles, but filtered down even to common folk, though usually with less polish and more stuttering. And perhaps you smirk as you imagine medieval teenagers practicing rhymes under their breath, hoping to impress with words that were as clumsy as they were heartfelt. And you recall that songs too were vessels of romance, for minstrels wandered from town to town, carrying tales of love, heartbreak, and scandal, turning private affairs into public entertainment long before gossip columns were invented. And you cannot help but laugh softly at how very little has changed, since even then people consumed the romances of the rich and powerful like bedtime stories, eager to hear who had been faithful, who had strayed, and who had written the most embarrassing verse about someone else's wife. And as you pause near a chapel wall, you see a carving, initials scratched into the stone by some forgotten hand. A quiet testament that not all love needed rhyme or song. Sometimes it simply needed to be marked where someone might stumble across it centuries later, and you realize that whether sung by troubadours, scrawled in margins, or whispered under a window, words carried the power to bind, to wound, and to immortalize feelings that might otherwise have dissolved into the night. And you wonder if the poets of old ever realized that their loves, real or imagined, would ripple across centuries, still recited, still debated, still inspiring laughter and sighs beneath the same moon that once watched them swoon. You leave behind the faint hum of the minstrelless lute and find yourself wandering toward the heavy stone silhouette of the church at the edge of the square. Its bells long silent for the night, yet its influence still ringing in every corner of medieval love. Because if poetry festivals and secret meetings represented the daring improvisations of romance, then the church provided the rules, the script, and sometimes the whip to enforce them. And you feel the weight of its presence pressing down as you step over the threshold, the air cool and thick with incense, as though love itself must pass through this filter of smoke and solemnity before it could be considered respectable. And the well-known fact is that the medieval church held enormous sway over marriage, declaring it a sacred sacrament by the 12th century, meaning that what once might have been a simple household agreement now required priestly blessing, binding love not only between two people, but also under the gaze of heaven, though heaven, you suspect, may have raised an eyebrow at some of the more practical arrangements disguised as piety. And you cannot help but notice the irony that while sermons railed endlessly about lust, sin, and temptation, monasteries and convents kept detailed records of scandals among the very clergy meant to guard purity. Which makes you think perhaps the preachers were not warning against human weakness so much as confessing it loudly in advance. And one quirky detail you stumble upon in an old manuscript tucked on a lectern is a set of penitential rules so oddly specific it seems someone must have tested them, such as the insistence that couples refrain from intimacy on more than half the nights of the year since feast days, fast days, Sundays, and even certain weekdays were off limits, leaving you to wonder how anyone managed to conceive children at all when the calendar was so hostile to affection. And the dry part of your mind mutters that perhaps the true miracle of medieval Europe was not saints or relics, but the simple existence of babies. And as you drift past flickering candles, you overhear muttered prayers from a confessional, where a young man stammers out a confession that sounds suspiciously like he has been meeting a girl near the well too often. And you realize that love in this world carried not only the risk of social scandal, but also spiritual weight, because sins of the flesh were treated as eternal stains, punishable not only in gossip, but in doctrine, though historians still argue about how rigorously these rules were enforced, because while priests thundered from pulpits about damnation, the endless stream of fines, secret marriages and court cases suggests that people either did not listen very well or were simply experts at pretending. And you imagine the priest who, while officially denouncing passion, also quietly pocketed bribes to look the other way at clandestine unions, and you have to admit that hypocrisy is perhaps the one tradition the church upheld with absolute consistency. And yet, for all its restrictions, the church also gave love a certain legitimacy, anchoring it in ritual, ensuring that promises carried not just social but eternal weight. And perhaps there was comfort in that. A reassurance that even in a messy, unpredictable world, marriage had a divine stamp that elevated it above mere barter, though whether that sanctity truly softened the daily grind of living with another person is a question no sermon ever answered. And as you step back into the night, leaving the incense behind, you glance at the moon above and cannot help but wonder if the church truly tamed love or merely redirected it, wrapping it in layers of ritual while the human heart continued to rebel in alleys, festivals and songs, just as it always had, and just as it always will. You wander away from the solemn shadow of the church and into the quieter lanes that lead toward the larger homes of merchants and minor nobles, where the smell of hearth smoke mixes with the faint perfume of dried lavender hanging from doorways. And as you pass beneath the shuttered windows, you realize that while festivals and poems made romance look spontaneous, the truth was that many couples never had the luxury of choosing each other freely, because family strategies, land, and money often outweighed affection, and arranged matches were the real foundations on which marriages were built, leaving love itself to catch up later, if it ever bothered to arrive at all. And the well-known fact here is that noble marriages in particular were calculated alliances, binding families together to consolidate wealth, secure peace, or expand influence, meaning that a young woman might find herself betrothed to a man she had never spoken to, simply because his castle came with fertile fields, while her own dowry carried barrels of grain and political leverage. And as you walk, you overhear the clipped voices of two men negotiating in a courtyard, their words full of land boundaries and inheritance rights, with the girl in question sitting silently nearby like an object waiting to be handed over. Her face blank but her eyes heavy, and you cannot help but feel the weight of how little her opinion mattered in this moment. Though the irony is that her presence was necessary to seal the deal, like the signature at the bottom of a contract, which in essence she was. And you think of how this arrangement stripped romance of its choice yet dressed it in the respectable clothing of duty. And then you recall one quirky detail from records of rural villages. Families sometimes arranged matches when the children were still in their cradles, sealing alliances between households before the infants could even walk, leaving you to imagine two babies lying side by side while their parents already argued over dowries, which is both slightly horrifying and oddly comedic, since it means the first gift exchanged between the future bride and groom might have been a teething toy, and you let out a dry laugh at how little chance there was for romance to bloom under such arrangements, though you suppose some couples eventually grew fond of each other simply by force of proximity. And historians still debate just how unhappy these arranged marriages were, because while chronicles complain bitterly about loveless unions, other accounts suggest that some couples did form genuine partnerships, raising children and running households together, with a kind of quiet loyalty that might not sound like passion but did provide stability, though whether that stability was enough to soothe the human craving for affection remains an open question. And as you drift past a doorway, you see a young woman clutching a rosary, her face turned downward as her parents speak with a suitor's family inside. And you cannot help but wonder what is passing through her mind. Fear, resignation, or perhaps even relief that the choice is finally out of her hands. For in a world where choice was such a rare luxury, perhaps letting others decide offered a strange kind of comfort, though one suspects many hearts were broken quietly beneath the surface of these transactions. And you think again of the irony that while bards sang of love so powerful it defied kingdoms, real kingdoms were busy dismantling personal desire and rearranging lives for political advantage, a contrast so stark it borders on parody. And yet within this parody were real lives, real emotions, some bending to the weight of obligation, others snapping under it, and you cannot help but picture how many secret loves must have been sacrificed on the altar of family strategy, how many whispered promises dissolved when faced with the blunt force of a signed agreement. And as you move further into the night, hearing the muffled sound of a quill scratching as another contract is drawn up, you realize that in medieval times, love may have been celebrated in poems and festivals, but its fate was often decided at a table covered in parchment, where ink, wax, and the steady hand of a notary sealed futures far more tightly than any ribbon ever could. You leave behind the echo of family negotiations and step into the quiet shadows of narrow alleys, the air thicker here, carrying the scent of damp stone and overturned hay, and with every step you become aware that behind the carefully arranged matches and contracts, there always existed another world, a secret one, where hearts refused to obey parchment and wax seals, where forbidden love simmered like wine hidden beneath the table. And while nobles spoke of dowries and inheritances, lovers spoke in glances, risking scandal for a taste of something genuine, though everyone knew the penalties could be harsh. Because the church regarded adultery and illicit unions as not only moral failings, but threats to the sacred order, and punishments ranged from public shaming to severe penance, sometimes even mutilation in the most dramatic records, which is your well-known fact to anchor the dread. Yet somehow, despite the risk, countless people sought love outside the lines drawn for them, as if defiance was itself intoxicating. And as you drift past a shuttered tavern, you hear the faint scrape of a lute, a song about a knight who fell hopelessly for a miller's daughter, and you picture how scandalous that would have been, because knights were bound to ideals of courtly love, expected to admire unattainable noble ladies from afar, not tumble into the hayloft with someone who sold flour. Yet the reality was that forbidden pairings like this must have been far more common than the chronicles admit, for human nature has always leaned toward the inconvenient, and the more forbidden the fruit, the sweeter the bite, or so poets claimed, though perhaps they were only trying to justify their own poor decisions. And here you discover one of those quirky little details from medieval life. Some lovers, too fearful to meet openly, communicated through loaves of bread, carving symbols or messages into the crust before passing them along as innocent deliveries, which means that what looked like an ordinary gift of food could actually be a smuggled declaration of longing. And you cannot help but smile at the thought of a baker innocently selling a round loaf, while knowing full well that inside the pattern of cuts on top, two desperate lovers were whispering across the silence of their lives. And while it is endearing, it is also absurd. Because what if a hungry sibling simply tore into the loaf before the intended recipient ever saw the message, leaving one half of the romance utterly confused about why the other never replied, the medieval equivalent of your text message being left unread, and you chuckle softly, imagining a crestfallen suitor, wondering if his metaphorical bread emoji failed to deliver. But just as quickly, you sense the danger, for secrecy was essential, and when discovered, scandal erupted like a fire in dry thatch, devouring reputations in moments. And historians still debate whether medieval society was truly as prudish as the church records claim, or whether those stern sermons and laws were more like scare tactics than reflections of daily life. Because while the official narrative paints a picture of strict morality, court records reveal case after case of affairs, secret meetings, even elopements, suggesting people were constantly pushing against the cage built around them. And perhaps communities looked the other way more often than the clergy would like to admit, tolerating these affairs so long as they did not threaten property or inheritance. For love was scandalous, yes, but money was sacred. And as you walk on, you hear the sudden laughter of two young voices from a hidden doorway. The sound instantly stifled as they spot you, and you glimpse only the quick flash of a hand, pulling another deeper into the shadows, leaving you to wonder how many such moments played out nightly across towns and villages, invisible yet ever present. And the dry humor here, of course, is that while priests preached endlessly against lust, even monasteries themselves were often whispered about as places where vows of chastity bent under the weight of temptation, which goes to show that no rule book, however divine, ever managed to overrule human desire completely. And as you continue, the street opens into a small square where a wooden pillory stands empty under the moonlight, its rough edges splintered from years of use. And you imagine what it must have felt like for someone condemned for adultery to stand locked here, the crowd jeering, rotten vegetables flying, dignity stripped away more harshly than clothing, and you feel a chill as you realize how public shame itself was the real punishment. For bruises heal, but reputations rarely do. And still, people risked it all because the pull of forbidden love has always outweighed the threat of humiliation. Though you cannot help but smirk at the thought that half the people doing the jeering in the crowd were probably sneaking around with their own secrets. Hypocrisy being the oldest tradition of all. And just when you think you have heard enough cautionary tales, you stumble upon another whisper, carried on the night air. A tale of a young noblewoman who fell in love with her father's squire, their meetings arranged under the cover of falconry training, which is both romantic and slightly ridiculous, since it meant their declarations of passion came with the smell of bird droppings and leather gloves. But perhaps that was the very absurdity that made their stolen time together memorable. And it strikes you how ordinary details, breadbirds, or even the simplest excuses of daily life, became the cover for extraordinary risks, risks that people took again and again, even knowing how easily it could all collapse into ruin. And so you walk on deeper into the labyrinth of medieval love gone wrong, where every shadow seems heavy with both fear and longing, and where your next step might uncover yet another story of scandal that shaped not just lives, but entire reputations in ways no one dared to speak aloud during daylight. You can feel the weight of the night pressing softly against your eyelids, now the kind of heaviness that does not demand, but rather suggests nudging you towards surrender, as though history itself has been slowly weaving a blanket out of candle smoke, whispers and echoes of medieval halls that no longer stand. And it has draped that blanket over your shoulders, drawing you inward, coaxing you downward, as if every stone street you have wandered tonight was just another step closer to your own bed. The cobblestones quietly leading you not to a tavern or a market stall, but here, to this moment of stillness. Your breath evens out as you let yourself imagine you are sitting just outside a wooden cottage after the feasting is over. The faint glow of torches giving way to a star-pocked sky. Your hands folded loosely in your lap as though you have all the time in the world, and indeed you do, because nothing waits on you tonight except the gentle rhythm of sleep that is stretching out before you, like a long meadow path without end. Soft grass cushioning your steps, soft wind brushing against your cheeks, soft earth beneath your soles, so that every detail from the medieval world that once seemed brash and loud, the clang of armor, the gossip at markets, the songs echoing through feast halls, now fades to a muffled hum like a lullaby played from another room, distant but familiar, faint enough that you cannot quite make out the words, yet close enough to warm you with a sense of belonging. And as you sit there in this imagined hush, you start to notice your body responding. Shoulders lowering from their perches, fingers unclenching from their quiet fists, the whole of you remembering what it feels like to rest without duty, without obligation, without the endless buzzing of modern clocks, and you smile faintly at the thought that perhaps people long ago, for all their hardships and fleas and drafty stone walls, also knew this same exact quiet, because at the end of the day, whether in the year 1324 or 2024, the body still sighs with gratitude when it finds stillness. And so here you are, part of a long unbroken line of weary souls who once sat at the edge of a bed, or the edge of a fire, waiting for sleep to wrap its arms around them the way you are waiting now. You breathe deeper, slower, noticing how even the imagined air feels cooler, smoother, as though you have slipped into some secret corridor of time where nothing bad can touch you. Not scandalous whispers of the court, not the booming voice of a priest declaring your fate, not the relentless work that fields and animals demand. Because this is a rare pocket of history made just for you, a suspended hush, and you get to linger here as long as you like. Every inhale drawing you further inward, every exhale laying down another stone in the pathway that leads to complete rest. And perhaps you wonder, with a trace of humor, if medieval people would envy the way you can sprawl out in your bed without sharing space with 3 siblings or a goat, and whether they would laugh at your soft pillows as excessive luxuries or secretly long to sink into them themselves. But such wondering only makes you softer still, because the jokes do not sting. They only float like fireflies at dusk. Brief, gentle distractions before fading into the night, leaving you even calmer than before. And if your mind drifts back to the stories of love, of courting, of feasts, of rituals, let them swirl not as sharp images but as slow-motion ripples, the kind that spread across a quiet pond after you toss in a pebble, stretching wider and wider until they blur into the glassy stillness of the surface once again. And by then you realize that you are no longer gripping the story, but letting the story hold you, cradling you like the dim outline of a castle wall in fog, strong enough to protect, distant enough not to disturb, steady enough to remind you that the world keeps turning whether you are awake or not, and that knowledge, oddly, feels like permission. Permission to release the day, permission to close the heavy wooden door of thought, to slide the latch across the iron brackets of worry, to let yourself drift down through candlelight into shadow, and through shadow into the deep velvet of sleep, as if you are being guided by a procession of unseen monks, humming low and even, carrying lanterns not to light the way, but to remind you there is a way. There is always a way down into safety, into warmth, into a place where you are no longer audience, but participant in the oldest ceremony of all, the ceremony of rest, performed not by priests or kings, but by the quiet machinery of your own body, a ceremony that asks nothing of you but to lie still and allow it. And in that realization, you feel the first real tug of dreams waiting at the edge of your awareness, waiting like old companions ready to take your hand. And now, as you lean further into that invisible embrace of night, the edges of thought blur even more until the flickering images of medieval banquets and hushed romances dissolve into something softer, something less detailed and more like watercolor painted across the inside of your mind. And though you may still hear faint echoes, the scrape of a lute string, the rustle of a velvet gown, the crack of bread at a wedding feast, they arrive as though muffled by layers of distance not sharp enough to hold you awake, only gentle enough to rock you further into quiet. And it occurs to you that the same way people long ago trusted the rhythm of the church bells to mark their days, You can trust the rhythm of your own breathing to mark this night. Slow tolls of inhale and exhale counting time. Not in hours, but in deepening peace, until even that awareness grows heavy, as though your very thoughts are melting wax candles guttering into still pools. You feel yourself pulled downward the way a stone slips into a pond, not harshly, but with surrender. And the water welcomes you, holds you, stills you, while ripples carry away the last chatter of your mind, so that all that remains is sensation, the soft weight of blankets, the warmth of your own skin, the faint hum of silence. Imagine, if you like that, you are lying not in your own room, but in a high medieval chamber, stone walls pressing inward with cool quiet, a rush mat beneath your feet, a fire reduced to a single glow at the hearth, and though the room is large, there is no draught, no chill, because the air itself has decided to rest with you, each molecule settling into calm. In this chamber there is no duty waiting, no steward calling, no knock at the door, because the feast has ended. The songs have been sung, the vows spoken, the scandals whispered, and what lingers now is only aftermath. The most precious, quiet kind of aftermath, where the body, no matter what century it belongs to, finally allows itself to unclench. And perhaps a small smile curves at your lips at the thought that after all the pomp and rituals of love and marriage, after all the feasts and dances and ceremonies, medieval couples too must have longed for this very same feeling. The sweet blankness of lying down, the whisper of sheets or straw, the quiet closing of the eyes, and in that recognition you realize how little separates you from them, how universal this need for rest truly is, and that thought alone soothes you further, as though you have tapped into something eternal, something everyone has shared since the first fire was lit against the dark. So you give yourself permission to stop listening so closely, permission to let words slide into one another until they become less about meaning and more about rhythm, about lull, about the low, steady tide that always waits to take you under. If you notice your breaths growing longer, hold on to that, savor it, because it means the descent is happening. It means the body is obeying its oldest law, the law of sleep. And in this obedience there is no failure, no missing out, no duty shirked, only relief. And you are allowed to enjoy that relief without guilt. The sounds of the medieval world, iron hinges, footsteps on stone, laughter spilling from taverns, recede now into the farthest background, as distant as stars, and what replaces them is your own private quiet, the one that belongs only to you, where you do not have to impress anyone, or answer to anyone, or even think for anyone. Here you are, the whole of your own kingdom, and the law is stillness, the crown is rest. The throne is your bed. Let yourself sink into it fully, no longer hovering between alertness and surrender, but finally tipping, finally tumbling, finally dissolving into the soft darkness that waits with open arms, like an endless field beneath an endless night sky dotted with stars that blink slower, 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 until even they dim, until nothing remains but warmth and quiet and breath, and at last you drift into sleep. The oldest ritual, the truest vow, the gentlest feast your body could ever attend, and you are welcome here endlessly, peacefully, without end.